The sun filtered gently through the thick canopy of pinewood forest as Emma led the way, her boots crunching against the dirt trail. Behind her, Lucas carried their shared pack of supplies, while Sophie and Nate brought up the rear, laughing at an inside joke that the others couldn't hear. The group had been hiking together for years, and Pinewood was one of their favorite spots, quiet, serene, and untouched by the chaos of the town they'd left behind. "This is what I needed," Emma said, breathing in the earthy scent of moss and damp leaves. "No emails, no phones, just us and the trail." Lucas smirked. "Speak for yourself. I'm already missing breakfast burritos and Wi-Fi." "You'll live," she shot back playfully. The morning passed with ease, the well-trodden path leading them deeper into the forest. But as the sun climbed higher, they reached a fork in the trail where a barely visible path disappeared into a wall of ferns. The group hesitated. "This isn't on the map," Sophie said, holding up her phone. "I mean, there's supposed to be a clearing around here, but this doesn't match." Emma's curiosity piqued. "Maybe it's an old path. It could lead somewhere interesting." "I don't know," Lucas said, squinting at the overgrown trail. "It looks like no one's been through here in decades." "Exactly," Nate chimed in, adjusting his backpack. "That's the fun part, right? A little mystery." The group debated briefly before Emma stepped forward, brushing aside the ferns. "We came out here for adventure, didn't we?" As they ventured onto the path, the forest seemed to shift around them. The air felt heavier, cooler, as if the trail carried a life of its own. Their laughter faded, replaced by the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. Yet something about the quiet seemed unnatural. "It's too quiet," Sophie murmured, glancing around nervously. "Where are the birds?" No one answered, but unease settled over the group as they walked deeper into the woods, the unmarked trail stretching ahead like a forgotten invitation. The trail narrowed as they moved deeper into the woods, the dense foliage around them growing darker and more tangled. The laughter and easy banter from earlier were gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. Even Nate, usually the loudest of the group, seemed subdued. "Guys, look at this," Sophie called out, her voice trembling slightly. She had stopped in front of a tree with strange carvings etched into its bark. Spirals, intersecting lines, and jagged shapes formed a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be random. "Looks like old graffiti," Lucas said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Emma tilted her head, frowning at the carvings. "It feels off, like it's meant to say something." Without a word, Sophie reached out and traced her fingers over the spirals. Her hand lingered, and her expression went blank. "Sophie," Nate asked, his tone sharp with concern. She blinked and pulled her hand back abruptly. "It's fine," she said, though her voice was distant. "Just pretty." The group pressed on, but Sophie's behavior grew stranger. She began to lag behind, mumbling to herself and occasionally glancing over her shoulder. At one point, Emma caught her staring at another tree, whispering words none of them could understand. Nate wasn't faring much better. He kept stopping abruptly, turning his head as if listening to something just beyond their reach. "Do you hear that?" he asked at one point, his voice low. "It's like singing." "No," Emma said firmly, trying to shake the growing dread that gnawed at her. The air felt heavier with every step, as though the forest itself was watching. And deep within her, Emma felt an inexplicable pull forward, as though the trail was leading them somewhere they weren't meant to go. The trail ended abruptly in a clearing. The group froze, unsure of what they were looking at. The ground was covered in strange carvings, spirals etched into the soil like the markings they had seen on the trees. In the center was a larger spiral, perfectly symmetrical and disturbingly intricate. "What the hell is this?" Lucas muttered, stepping cautiously closer. Sophie suddenly dropped to her knees in front of the central spiral. Her hands dug into the dirt, her fingers trembling as if guided by an invisible force. She began whispering again, her voice growing louder until it turned into a guttural chant. "Sophie, stop!" Emma shouted, rushing toward her, but Sophie didn't seem to hear. Her body convulsed, and her head tilted back unnaturally. Her eyes were wide, but they weren't focused on anything, just empty and glassy. Nate stumbled backward, his breathing ragged. She's possessed or something, this is insane. Before Emma could reach Sophie, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Her vision blurred, and for a brief moment, she saw the clearing differently. The spirals glowed faintly, and shadowy figures stood at the edges of the forest, watching silently. When she blinked, the vision was gone, but the unease lingered. She's part of it now, Nate whispered, almost inaudibly. Emma turned to him, panic flashing across her face. What do you mean? Nate didn't answer. Instead, he dropped his bag and began walking toward the spiral, as if pulled by an invisible string. Lucas grabbed his arm, shaking him. Snap out of it, man. I have to. Nate mumbled, his eyes glazed. It's calling me. Emma grabbed Lucas and pulled him back. We need to get out of here. But Sophie stood suddenly, her movements jerky and unnatural. She turned to face them, her mouth twisting into a cruel smile that wasn't hers. It's too late, she said in a voice that wasn't hers either. You've already joined us. Night fell quickly, swallowing the clearing in darkness. A thick fog crept in, clinging to the ground and obscuring the carvings. The air grew colder, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. Sophie stood motionless at the center of the spiral, her shadow flickering unnaturally in the dim light of their lantern. Emma and Lucas huddled together, their fear palpable. Nate, meanwhile, was wandering aimlessly around the clearing, muttering incoherently. We have to go now, Lucas said, his voice firm despite the tremor in it. We can't stay here and leave them. Emma shot back, glancing at Nate and Sophie. They're not them anymore. Lucas snapped, gesturing at Sophie. Look at her. That's not Sophie. As if on cue, Sophie's head snapped toward them, her eyes gleaming in the lantern light. You can't leave, she said, her voice layered with something ancient and otherworldly. You belong to the forest now. The fog thickened, and shapes began to form within it, shadowy figures that moved with unnatural fluidity, circling the clearing. Nate suddenly screamed, clutching his head as he fell to the ground. His body convulsed violently, and when he looked up again, his eyes had the same empty, glassy look as Sophie's. Emma grabbed Lucas's arm, panic surging through her. What do we do? What do we do? Lucas fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a lighter. Fire, he said, his voice resolute. Fire can stop this. He found a dry branch near the edge of the clearing and lit it, the flames flickering weakly at first before growing stronger. As he thrust the burning branch toward Sophie, she recoiled, hissing like a wounded animal. The shadowy figures in the fog began to wail, their forms twisting and retreating from the light. Lucas turned to the spiral and thrust the branch into it. The flames roared to life, spreading across the carvings. The ground shook violently, and the forest itself seemed to scream in agony. The spirals burned away, the light driving back the fog and shadows. Run! Lucas shouted, dragging Emma with him as the clearing erupted in chaos. Lucas and Emma sprinted through the forest, the flames from the clearing casting eerie shadows around them. The trees groaned and creaked as if alive, their branches clawing at the fleeing pair. The path twisted unnaturally, but Lucas held tight to Emma's hand, pulling her forward. Behind them, the wails of the forest echoed, growing louder with each passing second. Sophie's voice, twisted and unrecognizable, called after them. You can't escape. You're part of us now. The spirals flashed in Lucas's mind, the glowing carvings seared into his memory. He felt the forest clawing at the edges of his mind, the whispers growing louder. For a brief moment he faltered, his vision swimming. Lucas! Emma screamed, snapping him out of it. They burst out of the dense foliage and into a small clearing bathed in moonlight. The screams and wails suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence. Lucas fell to his knees, gasping for air. Is it over? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas didn't answer. He glanced back at the forest, the towering trees standing as silent sentinels. The path they had escaped from was gone, swallowed by the woods. "It's not over," he finally said, his voice hollow. "It's never over." Weeks passed, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't truly escaped. The nightmares came every night. Visions of the spirals, of Sophie's twisted smile, of the shadowy figures in the fog. He had scoured every map and article about Pinewood Forest, but no mention of the unmarked trail or the carvings ever surfaced. To the outside world, it didn't exist. But Lucas knew better. He avoided Emma's calls, unable to face her after what they had been through. He spent his days in his apartment, blinds drawn, drowning in his guilt. His friends were gone, and he had no answers. One evening, as Lucas sat in the dark, he felt a chill breeze sweep through the room. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he turned toward the doorway. There, standing in the shadows, was Sophie. Her clothes were tattered, her face pale and gaunt, but her eyes were unmistakable, empty and glassy, just as they had been in the clearing. "You can't run forever," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo. Lucas froze, his heart pounding in his chest, and then, faintly, he heard it, the singing. The narrow streets of the old quarter were lined with weathered shopfronts, their signs faded and edges curling. Sarah pulled her coat tighter against the autumn chill as she wandered aimlessly, searching for something to spark her creativity. The past 6 months had been a blur of unfinished canvases and mounting bills, her once promising career as an artist now teetering on the edge of obscurity. She turned a corner and stopped in front of an antique shop she hadn't noticed before. Its crooked sign read Curiosities and Relics. The windows were dusty, obscuring the cluttered interior, but something about the place drew her in. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and leather. The dim lighting cast strange shadows across shelves crammed with peculiar items, tarnished mirrors, porcelain dolls, and ancient tools. As Sarah wandered deeper into the shop, her eyes fell on a small wooden box at the back of the room. "Ah, you found it," a raspy voice said. Sarah turned to see the shopkeeper, a gaunt man with piercing blue eyes. He smiled faintly, revealing teeth too white for his age. "It's an old artist's brush," he continued. "Quite the relic, really. I've had it for years." Curiosity piqued. Sarah opened the box. Inside was a paintbrush with a smooth wooden handle, darkened by time. The bristles, though worn, felt impossibly soft under her fingers. Etched into the handle were faint, spiraling carvings. "How much?" she asked. The shopkeeper hesitated, his smile faltering. "It's not for everyone," he said cryptically. "But if it calls to you, take it." The price was surprisingly low, and despite the odd exchange, Sarah purchased the brush. As she left the shop, the man's words echoed in her mind. It's seen a lot of beauty and pain. At home, Sarah placed the brush on her desk, eyeing it with a mixture of hope and unease. That night, as the city lights dimmed, she dreamt of swirling shadows and haunting whispers, unaware that her life had already begun to change. The next morning, sunlight streamed into Sarah's tiny studio, highlighting the scattered brushes and half-finished canvases that lined the room. She sat at her desk, turning the old brush over in her hands. The carvings seemed deeper now, their spirals almost hypnotic. "Let's see what you can do," she murmured, dipping the brush into a pool of deep blue paint. Her hand moved instinctively, almost without her guidance, sweeping across the blank canvas in fluid, deliberate strokes. The bristles glided effortlessly, leaving behind streaks of color, so vivid they looked alive. Hours passed in what felt like minutes. When she finally stepped back, Sarah gasped. The painting was unlike anything she had ever created. A stormy sea filled the canvas, waves crashing violently against jagged rocks beneath a dark, churning sky. It was hauntingly beautiful, the kind of piece that seemed to tell a story all on its own. But Sarah couldn't remember painting it. She touched the edge of the canvas, her fingers trembling. "How did I?" That night, Sarah placed the painting against the wall, trying to shake the unease that clung to her. As she drifted off to sleep, a faint whisper echoed through the room. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. The studio was silent, save for the creak of the wooden floor beneath the canvas. The stormy waves seemed to shift in the moonlight, their fury almost palpable. "It's just my imagination," she told herself, pulling the covers tighter. But deep down, she knew there was something wrong. The next morning, her phone buzzed with messages. A friend who had stopped by to collect supplies had seen the painting and posted it online. "This is incredible," one message read. "You've outdone yourself." Sarah stared at the screen. The praise felt hollow. She didn't know how to respond, because she couldn't take credit for what she had created. Weeks passed, and Sarah's studio was transformed. New canvases lined every wall, each one filled with haunting imagery she could barely remember painting. A forest cloaked in fog, shadowy figures reaching skyward, a crumbling city engulfed in flames, each piece more vivid and unsettling than the last. Collectors flocked to her, offering prices she couldn't have dreamed of before. Galleries called daily, and her inbox overflowed with praise. Yet Sarah felt no joy, only a growing emptiness. The brush had become her constant companion, and she couldn't stop painting. "Just one more," she would whisper to herself, though the whispers in her head often echoed the same words. One evening, as she worked on a piece depicting a faceless woman standing in a pool of blood, Sarah noticed something strange. The shadows in her studio seemed to stretch and shift, creeping closer to the easel. She glanced over her shoulder, but the room was still. "It's the stress," she muttered, gripping the brush tighter. But as the days turned into nights and nights into days, her grip on reality began to slip. Sarah would wake up to completed paintings she had no memory of starting, her hands stained with colors she didn't recognize. Her friends stopped calling, her phone messages going unanswered. "You've become a recluse," one had said during a rare visit. "This isn't healthy, Sarah." But she couldn't stop. The brush called to her, its spiral carvings almost glowing when she held it. The more she painted, the louder the whispers grew, filling her head with fragments of words she didn't understand. One night, Sarah finally looked closely at her most recent work, a towering figure cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing with hatred. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the figure was looking directly at her. "Who are you?" she whispered aloud, her voice trembling. The room remained silent, but the air seemed heavier, colder. Sarah felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her, watching her every move. And somewhere in the darkness, she thought she heard a voice reply, "You already know." Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She avoided her studio for days, but the pull of the brush was too strong. When she finally returned, she sat before an empty canvas, the brush trembling in her hand. "I won't let you control me," she whispered, as though addressing the brush itself. But as the bristles touched the canvas, her hand moved of its own accord. Stroke by stroke, a face began to emerge, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man with deep scars etched across his cheeks. His mouth was twisted into a snarl, his eyes burning with rage. The room grew colder, and the air thickened. Sarah tried to pull her hand away, but it wouldn't budge. Her breathing quickened as the face on the canvas seemed to come alive, its lips curling into a cruel smile. "You took my voice," a low, guttural voice growled, echoing through the studio. "Now you will give it back." The room around her dissolved into darkness, and Sarah found herself standing in another time, another place. She was in a dimly lit workshop, its walls lined with unfinished paintings. A man, thin, pale, and trembling, sat hunched over a canvas, his brush moving frantically. "This is my masterpiece," he muttered, his voice filled with desperation. Suddenly, the door burst open, and two men stormed in. "Enough!" one of them shouted. "You've gone too far." They seized the painter, dragging him toward the fireplace. His screams filled the air as they threw his brush into the flames. "No!" Sarah cried out, watching helplessly. The scene dissolved into ash and smoke, and she was back in her studio. The spirit's voice rang in her ears. "They silenced me. But you can make them see. Paint my story, or suffer as I did." Sarah collapsed to the floor, sobbing. She didn't want to paint anymore. She didn't want to see the horrors the brush revealed. But the spirit's presence loomed over her, suffocating her with its rage. The next day, Sarah made her decision. She gathered all her paintings, stacking them in the center of her studio. The brush lay on the desk, its spiraled carvings gleaming faintly in the dim light. "You can't make me do this anymore," she whispered, grabbing a can of lighter fluid. As she doused the paintings, the spirit's voice erupted in a furious roar. "You dare defy me!" Sarah lit a match and dropped it onto the pile. Flames roared to life, consuming the canvases in an instant. The studio filled with the acrid stench of burning paint and wood. The brush vibrated violently on the desk, its carvings glowing red-hot. Sarah grabbed it and threw it into the fire. The spirit's scream was deafening, a guttural howl that seemed to shake the very walls. Shadows writhed and twisted as the flames consumed the brush, the air thick with smoke and anger. When the fire finally died, the studio was in ruins. Ashes covered the floor, and the walls were charred black. But the brush was gone, and the room was silent. Sarah staggered outside, gasping for fresh air. For the first time in weeks, the whispers were gone. Weeks later, Sarah stood in her rebuilt studio, staring at the single painting she had saved. It was a portrait of the spirit, his scarred face still twisted with rage. She couldn't bring herself to destroy it. "Maybe it's over," she whispered to herself. But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her. One night, as she sat in the studio sketching, a familiar chill filled the air. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. There on her desk was the brush, unburnt and pristine, its spiraled carvings gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Sarah froze, unable to move. Her hand twitched involuntarily, reaching toward it. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the room with their haunting melody. As her fingers brushed the handle, she realized the truth. She could never escape. Elena adjusted the microphone stand in her small apartment, the familiar creak of its base grounding her in the quiet evening. The room was dimly lit, her only source of light a flickering desk lamp that cast long shadows across her modest space. Sheet music was scattered across the coffee table, corners curling from use. She took a deep breath and began to sing, her voice filling the room with the melancholy notes of an aria she had rehearsed countless times. Her voice wavered slightly, and she winced, frustrated. Perfection was elusive, and the weight of every failed audition bore down on her. "Again," she muttered, starting from the top. This time, something shifted. As Elena reached the crescendo, a second voice joined hers. The harmony was rich, ethereal, and perfectly aligned with her pitch. She froze, her voice cutting off mid-note. The second voice lingered for a moment longer, floating in the air like a memory. Elena spun around, her dark wavy hair brushing her shoulders. The room was empty, the only sound her own uneven breathing. She moved to the window, peering out into the quiet street below, but nothing seemed amiss. "It's nothing," she whispered, shaking her head. "Just tired." She sat back down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But as she resumed singing, the voice returned, weaving itself into her melody with a haunting perfection. It wasn't just an echo. It was alive. Elena stopped again, her heart racing. This time, she didn't look around. Instead, she leaned into the mystery, letting the voice guide her. Together, their duet created something extraordinary. When the song ended, the silence in the room felt heavier than before. For the first time in months, Elena felt a spark of hope. "Maybe this is it," she murmured to herself, her gaze lingering on the shadows dancing along the walls. Little did she know, the voice she welcomed so eagerly would soon unravel her world. The following night, Elena couldn't wait to practice again. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone, anticipation buzzing through her veins. She started with a simple warm-up, her voice soft and steady. But as she transitioned into a more complex piece, the second voice returned. It entered seamlessly, lifting the melody in a way that sent chills down her spine. Elena's breath hitched, but she didn't stop. This time, she embraced the presence, letting it guide her through the piece. Her voice blended with the other, creating harmonies she hadn't thought possible. The sound was hauntingly beautiful. When the final note faded, she lowered the microphone and stood in stunned silence. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadows in the room flickered as though responding. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. "I'm being ridiculous," she muttered, running a hand through her hair. The next day, Elena auditioned for a local competition. She hadn't planned to rely on the voice, but as she began her song, it joined her once again. The judges sat forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from mild interest to captivated awe. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. "That was extraordinary," one of the judges said. "I've never heard a voice like yours before." Elena's chest swelled with pride, but beneath her excitement, unease simmered. Was this talent truly hers? At home, as she replayed the audition in her mind, she noticed something strange. The shadows in her apartment were longer than usual, moving as if alive. And when she passed the mirror in her hallway, she could have sworn she saw someone standing behind her. Elena's life transformed almost overnight. Invitations to perform poured in, her calendar filling faster than she could comprehend. Each performance drew rapturous applause, her haunting duets leaving audiences spellbound. But something was wrong. The voice wasn't just guiding her anymore. It was controlling her. During rehearsals, it would whisper, hold the note longer, or sing with more pain. And every time she obeyed, the results were breathtaking. But the whispers followed her offstage, growing louder at night. Elena began waking to strange occurrences. Music notes scrawled across her walls in red ink. Her microphone stand tipped over, though she hadn't touched it. And then there were the nightmares. Vivid scenes of her standing on stage before a hostile crowd, her voice cracking as they jeered. One night, during an intense rehearsal, Elena saw her reflection shift. In the mirrored surface of her piano, her face faded, replaced by another, a woman's. She was beautiful, with pale skin, piercing green eyes, and long black hair that fell in waves over her shoulders. But her expression was twisted with sorrow and rage. "You can't ignore me forever," the woman said, her voice eerily familiar. Elena stumbled backward, knocking over her stool. "Who are you?" The woman's reflection didn't waver. "I'm Isabella. Once, I was like you, a singer with a voice that could make angels weep. But I was betrayed, silenced." Elena's throat tightened. "What do you want?" "To finish what I started," Isabella said. "Through you." Over the next few days, Isabella revealed her tragic past. A star in the 19th century opera scene, she had been sabotaged by jealous rivals. Her final performance ended in disaster when she fell to her death during an aria. Elena tried to resist, but Isabella's influence only grew stronger. The spirit demanded Elena perform her signature piece, insisting it would cement their shared legacy. The night of the competition arrived. Elena stood backstage, her hands gripping the microphone. The air was electric with anticipation, the audience beyond the curtain murmuring in excitement. "You're ready," Isabella whispered, her voice coiling in Elena's mind. Elena shivered. "I don't want to do this," she muttered. "You have no choice." The announcer's voice boomed through the theater. "Please welcome Elena Santos." The spotlight blinded her as she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. The piano began to play, soft and mournful, and Elena opened her mouth to sing. At first, her voice was her own, pure, trembling with emotion. But as the aria swelled, Isabella took over. The shift was subtle at first, a deeper resonance, a sharper clarity. Then it became unmistakable. Elena felt her limbs stiffen, her consciousness slipping as Isabella consumed her entirely. The spirit's voice poured through her, rich and commanding, filling the theater with a sound that seemed to transcend human ability. The audience was enraptured, tears streaming down their faces. But Elena was trapped, a silent observer within her own body. Isabella forced Elena to hold a note longer than she thought possible, her chest burning with the effort. As the final chords echoed, the theater erupted into applause. But Isabella wasn't done. A sudden vision overtook Elena, a memory not her own. She stood in a grand 19th century opera house, surrounded by gilded walls and chandeliers. On stage, Isabella sang her final aria. The crowd roared, but their cheers turned to screams as Isabella fell, her body striking the ground with a sickening thud. Elena jolted back to reality, gasping. She dropped the microphone, the sound reverberating through the stunned theater. "You will give me this stage," Isabella hissed in her mind, "or I will take everything from you." Elena stood frozen on stage, the weight of Isabella's presence pressing down on her. The applause faded, replaced by murmurs of confusion. Summoning every ounce of strength, Elena whispered, "No." Isabella's voice growled in fury. "You would throw this all away." "Yes." Elena tore off the microphone and stepped forward. "I'm sorry," she said to the audience, her voice shaking. Then she sang a single, discordant note, breaking the perfect harmony Isabella demanded. The spirit screamed. The theater's lights flickered, and the air grew cold. Isabella's form emerged briefly, her beautiful face contorted with rage. "You will regret this," she hissed, her figure dissolving into shadows that disappeared into the rafters. Elena collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Backstage, she ignored the confused organizers and left the theater, her voice hoarse and her body trembling. She knew her career was over, but she didn't care. For the first time in weeks, she felt free. Months later, Elena lived in a quiet town, far from the city. She had traded sold-out theaters for a small studio where she taught children to sing. Her voice was damaged beyond repair, but she had found peace, or so she thought. One evening, while sorting through old belongings, Elena found a recording of her final performance. She hesitated but pressed play. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but as the harmony filled the room, Elena's blood ran cold. It wasn't just her voice. It was Isabella's, clear and powerful. The room grew colder, and the shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally. Elena's breath hitched as she realized her own shadow was moving, its mouth opening in silent song. The recording ended, but the melody continued. Elena closed her eyes. She wasn't free. Not yet.